Hi, I'm Dr. Dave Janda. Welcome back to the Insider Insight Show. I'm honored to have back with me someone who is a very dear friend and someone who has been a leader, not just in the state of Michigan, but really as a role model to every person holding a political position who is a freedom-based patriot. My guest today is Senator, he was a state senator from the state of Michigan for 2 terms, Senator Pat Colbeck. A little background on Pat. He earned his bachelor's degree and master's degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Michigan. He has 24 years of experience in management consulting and in engineering. So when we talk about a rocket scientist, well, that's Pat Colbeck. And in addition to that, he served, as I mentioned, 2 terms in the Michigan State Senate. It's interesting. Pat is a self-avowed non-politician. He is one of the only non-politicians that I know of who has held political office and, if you will, focused on what the people, in our case, the state of Michigan, needed. His priorities were the people of the state of Michigan, not the priorities of Pat Colbeck. Pat probably doesn't, well, I'm sure he's okay with me saying this. Pat was such a truth teller in the Senate. And at the time, the Michigan Senate was, quote, Republican, end quote, dominated. Pat was ostracized by the Republican leadership for telling the truth, for taking on the powers that be, for speaking truth and facts, and, if you will, for taking on the lobbyist community. The lobbyist community does not just run the Democratic Party. They run the Republican Party. And it adversely affects not just every person in the state of Michigan. This happens in every state legislature, and it happens, obviously, in Washington. It affects every person in our country. It's my honor to have back with me. And Pat now has branched out. He has a fantastic website called letsfixstuff.org. Letsfixstuff.org. Pat, welcome back to the Insider Insight Show.
Oh, Dave, always great to talk with you, and I'm kind of glad we're in audio-only mode because your viewers don't have to see me blushing at that nice introduction, so I really appreciate it.
Well, we have Skype doesn't like you, doesn't like me, so they want to mess with us today, and okay, we'll just deal with it, we'll just go with it. So, Pat, it's kind of like the opposition you faced in the Michigan Senate.
Yeah.
Pat, you're very open about this. Level with our listeners and our viewers here about your experience in the Michigan Senate, because you wrote actually a fantastic book as well called Wrestling with Alligators that really focuses on what really happens behind closed doors. Educate our listeners and viewers.
Well, first, everybody needs to understand that we are in the midst of a war right now. It's an ideological war, and it's not a war between Republicans and Democrats, and that was very clear when I was serving in the Michigan Senate. I was in a Michigan Senate caucus that had, on paper, the first term it was 26 Republicans, second term it was 27 Republicans out of a total Senate membership of 38. And so we had what was called a supermajority, which is a very nice position to be in. If you look at what's going on at the federal level, and they have something called cloture, they need 60 votes just to even talk about something on the Senate floor there. We actually had the equivalent of 67 votes, if you would, in the Michigan Senate, and that allowed us pretty much to do whatever the heck we wanted. Now, unfortunately, everything that we wanted to go off and do wasn't necessarily what people had sent us up into office to go off and do. And here I was in the Republican Party, and we had Republicans leading efforts to expand Obamacare in the state. We had Republicans leading efforts to promote taxes on seniors. We had Republicans promoting taxes as the only solution to go off and fix the roads. I mean, none of the folks that ran for office campaigned on these issues, but when they got in there, they did something completely different. And I know just to anchor the fact that this is not Republicans versus Democrats. It's not unique to them. You had a great guest on not too long ago, Karen Whitsett, Representative Karen Whitsett from Detroit. She happened to serve in the same district as another outspoken Democrat by name of Harvey Santana, Representative Harvey Santana. Both of them were ostracized by members of the Democrat Party. So you detailed pretty well what happened to Karen when she had the audacity of thanking President Trump for letting her know about the promise of hydroxychloroquine, which she attributes to saving her life. Representative Harvey Santana was pretty outspoken too. His priorities were always the priorities of the people in the district. And I walked through his district with Harvey Santana. And if you ever remember that Seinfeld episode where Jerry was a mailman walking down the street saying hello to everybody, that's how it was with Harvey. He was a man of the people. Now, I didn't always agree with Harvey on policy issues. I mean, but I'll tell you, his priorities were right. And so are Karen Whitsett's priorities. Same thing. I don't agree with her on a lot of policy directions or how to fix stuff, but gosh darn it, I'd rather work with somebody that had the priority of public service up there and the service their constituents over having somebody that was ideologically in lockstep with me, because we could work together for solutions. And that's kind of the crux of this let's fix stuff theme, is that there's a lot of different ways of fixing stuff, but what we're seeing right now behind the curtain, if you will, when we were wrestling gators, and it's I talk about it quite a bit on the different tactics that are used behind how government really works in that book, Wrestling Gators. It's the same people that are there. It's evident that there are people actually trying to create the problems that they have the solution to go off and fix. And it's for somebody that came in from the private sector without any political experience when I first ran into office. I bright-eyed and bushy-tailed saying, guys, look at all the stuff we got to go off and fix, and here's some good solutions. No. They already had the solutions that they wanted to go off and push. And one of the first wake-up calls, and this is something that's very important for everybody to understand, is that we're kind of being run in a form of an oligarchy, not in a constitutional republic. And what I mean by that is that it's a rule of the few over the many. And the few in this case are the Senate Majority Leader, the Speaker of the House, and the Governor, which is also one of the reasons why I ran for governor. I was so frustrated getting blocked in the Senate that a lot of those policy solutions were still out there and wanted to go off and push them. And you can see those solutions out at Let's Fix Stuff too if you want to help out on that. But it's when you realize that it's an oligarchy, the Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker in particular, you may think that in the case of Michigan, we got 110 reps that serve in the state house. We've got 38 senators that sit there. You'd think that everybody would have a voice, right? No, the Senate Majority Leader is the one who determines who sits on committees. He determines who's the chairman of those committees. The chairman, in turn, determines what bills get moved forward or not. Also, Senate Majority Leader has final say on whether or not a bill moves or not. And they're the ones that are negotiating with the governor in the House on what moves or not. So he may tell you right to your face that your bill is going to move, and then meanwhile, behind the scenes, he's working with the Speaker of the House to be the bad guy and say it's not going to move. This is it's a lot of power put in there. And some of these guys and gals that are serving in this capacity, they're the reason that they're acting the way that they're doing, because in order to get into those positions of influence, to those positions of power, they have to generate a lot of money. And they get a lot of that money from the lobbyists that issue them their marching orders. Now, these guys that are serving those positions, most of them just care about the power. They're just essentially higher or useful idiots with higher titles, if you will, in Lenin's vernacular. They just see that as a vehicle to getting into those positions. But that funding comes with handcuffs. That comes with constraints, and it comes with orders. And if somebody is violating any of those orders, like I had a tendency to do apparently, then you're going to be held accountable. And I had an interesting story. I was my first term in the Michigan Senate, I was actually elected to Senate leadership. People respected my background, what I brought to the table. I was a unique perspective coming in as an aerospace engineer. I'd worked on space station, worked with the Department of Defense, and I was chair of the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs and State Police budget. And as the chair of those budgets, we turned around our veteran services from one of the worst in the nations to one of the best in the nation. So from a meritocracy perspective, you think, second term, we got to put this guy in a better position of influence.
Right.
That's not the way it works.
No, he wasn't.
So I came into that second term, and I found out via tweet from Detroit News a reporter, Chad Livengood, that I was the only one that did not receive any chairmanships in my second term. And I texted the incoming Senate Majority Leader, his name was Arlen Meekoff at the time. I go, well, why is that? You know, I think by any measurable standard, when I implemented these service level agreements and quarterly metrics reviews, and we turned around the performance of these agencies, we did a pretty darn good job. And I'd love to do that for even more departments. And he goes, well, you didn't deserve it. I go, really? Go, what do you mean? I didn't, he said I didn't earn it. Sorry, those are the exact words. And I go, well, we're going to have a meeting and talk about this. And so I had a one-on-one meeting with him afterwards. And I said, well, what do you mean I didn't earn it? And he said, number one, you were too vocal in your opposition to Medicaid expansion. You know, I was on the Republican side of that ticket, and this is a Republican Senate Majority Leader. And number two, you were too vocal in your opposition to Common Core standards, which, once again, was also a Republican platform issue. So it's very clear, and we got evidence to boot, that it is not about platform. It's not about principle. It's about another level of power brokering, if you will, that remains unseen to most people behind the rhetoric that you hear in the media, behind the rhetoric that you hear from this triumvirate of Senate Majority Leader, Speaker, and Governor. So I wish I could say it was different. But I got one heck of a honking red pill when I got in there. And sometimes, if you want to get along up there, you just take the blue pill.
Even though you're supposed to be doing what's best for your district and the people you represent, it's what's
Absolutely.
really what's best, as you point out, from the lobbyists. So Meekoff, for example, was probably getting huge donations from the insurance industry, the Blue Cross Blue Shields of Michigans, who were advocating for Medicaid expansion, correct? And the Hospital Association and the like, correct?
Yeah, and a lot of around the medical marijuana industry, and a lot which he ended up supporting afterwards, and then or getting supported by, I should say. And
on the Common Core side, was he getting money from the Teachers Union organization and the like?
I didn't follow the Common Core thread, but typically, yeah, the folks who are promoting that are also the same folks that help fund senior.
And just to reiterate, this was a Republican leader of the Senate, correct?
Yep.
Now, he was really not much different than the then, quote, Republican, end quote, Governor Rick Jennifer Schneider, correct?
Correct. Well, actually...
Because Schneider was pushing Medicaid expansion, loving
Right.
Obamacare as a Republican.
Yeah, on paper there was a big difference, but in actuality, no. I mean, it was very frustrating during that tenure for sure.
So Pat, when people say, well, everybody with an R after their name are great, and everybody with a D after their name are subject to criticism or problems, that's a bunch of BS, because really, a lot of these people have a G after their name for globalist, and they're just hiding behind the R or the D. Is that a false statement?
I can't say it's a false statement, but I will caution on this one here, because now it gets into a matter of globalist light versus full up global, right?
Right.
And let me put it this way: if we go off and get in a Democrat Senate Majority Leader or a Democrat House Speaker, it's pedal to the metal. We're going into full Ocasio-Cortez mode, and there's nothing to slow it down. At least when you have an R next to the name, somebody's ostensibly pumping the brakes every once in a while. So we're still heading to the same destination. It's just at a much slower speed. So I'm not in the camp that says it doesn't matter if you vote Republican or Democrat, because there's much more of a opportunity to turn things around and get people woken up with the R's than the D's. But gosh darn it, I am so disappointed with the R's, that it needs a rebirth, a rejuvenation in that party, or a third party to smack it into some sense here, because it is. I don't know. It's frustrating, because on paper you would sit there and say, from a platform perspective, you got to go. Republican Party is the best platform. I mean, all the way back to its origins. I mean, we're the party of freedom. We push for abolition of slavery. The Democrats were the ones pushing for slavery. The KKK was their enforcement arm. It was the dirty little secret in our textbooks nowadays in education was that was an anti-Republican organization. It was not an anti-black. It just so happens that most of the Republicans in the South at the time were black. People don't know this, but there were over 1,200 whites that were lynched out of the 4,743 lynchings that were out there. But this is being wiped from our textbooks and collective memory, which is part of that globalist, if you will, push for the fundamental transformation of America. And all they need to succeed is a bunch of willy, weak-kneed R's with R's next to their name that don't want to cause any conflict, and they just want to go off and make sure that they get reelected in their next election.
And they want to take a knee.
Right. They will, exactly. And they will take a knee and sell their soul and sell the principles of the Republican platform down the river, just so that they, and some of these guys, maybe they don't even think it through deeply enough, but they're in this ends justify the means mode, where they sit there and go, well, if I go along with this stuff, eventually I'll be in a position where I can actually go off and shape the battlefield and do everything that we want to go off and do. And to a very minor extent, sometimes that happens. I'll grant it to them. But I'll tell you, in the big picture, we're still losing ground. So, it's nice that they might, at least in their heart of hearts, think that they want to do the right thing. But every once in a while, you got to look at what the actual results are. And so if our frontier and the land that we own, or the ground that we preside over, if you will, this rhetorical ground, if you will, keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, what good is it to go off and take that war of attrition approach? We have to have people that stand up. We need people like Karl Manke, frankly, that says enough is enough. We need people that will say, this is not right. I like people that are outspoken. Folks like Candace Owen, for example. She ain't taking any of that narrative. And you know why she's so effective? Is because she doesn't just stand up and stand against it and say, talk to the hand. She knows why she's standing up. And too many of folks, particularly with R's next to their name, the reason that they're silent, the reason that they're not effective, is because they do not know what they are standing for.
Right. So let's talk about where we need to go with this war of ideological subversion. Let's talk about specific issues, and as you do with your website, let's fixstuff.org. Let's fix some stuff. Let's talk about fixing some stuff, Pat.
All right.
Let's talk about what's happening currently with COVID-19, coronavirus. You've focused on this as well.
Yeah.
Let's talk about fixing some stuff. Go ahead.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I ran for governor against Governor Whitmer, so I did my best to make sure that she wasn't in the position of authority that she is currently assuming. And so anything that I say here is not a bunch of Monday morning quarterbacking. If you want to go up into my Facebook page at Patrick Colbeck, or Colbeck for Governor page, I was pretty outspoken right from the beginning of all this. And
yes, you were.
Early on, I said, listen, I just want to see a scientific, rational, data-based approach to addressing the solution. And since day one, we haven't seen that. Matter of fact, you're the first one to highlight that she's hiding the data out of the gates. And the power of you and your program helped turn the lights back on for a little bit there. But still, Michigan ranks last in transparency around COVID-19 out of all the states. And that's not by accident.
No, it's not.
as an engineer, I realize that the more sensors I have providing data to my controller, the better I can control something. So the more information you have, the more apt you are to be able to control it. If you keep that information to yourself, you can control the people that information pertains to. And that's exactly what she is doing right now. Mm-hmm. But if we were taking a scientific, rational, data-driven approach to this, you would sit there and go, number one, I want to understand three key data points. Number one, I want to know what the real infection rate is. And that's got to be statistically sampled. And you've and I have both been through all this in Michigan, mm-hmm. especially in the early days of the coronavirus. They had these drive-up test centers, and you could drive up to that test and say, "I need to get a COVID test," and they say, "Well," they walk you through the basic symptoms. Can you smell? You have respiratory issues. You got a fever. And unless you were on death's bed, they still wouldn't swab you for the test.
That's exactly right.
So it was kind of a self-selection bias, if you will. So we're only gonna test the people that are on death's bed, if you will. And so guess what? They're gonna come up with a number that says the infection rate is some crazy high number. So the next key data point is at a hospitalization rate, mm-hmm. right? Because that hospitalization rate, when everybody talks about flattening the curve,
that's right.
What are they doing? They're talking about making sure that we don't exceed the capacity in the hospital system to take on patients that are seriously ill. Mm-hmm. And so, and by the way, this is something I always make sure to point out. The only reason flattening the curve is an issue at all is because we have something called certificate of need.
That's right.
Which is a government instituted constraint on the number of hospital beds and other medical equipment that we have in the state. So once again, we were talking about government creating the problem that they have the solution for. Well, they did create the problem around capacity mm-hmm. to a large measure with bad programs like certificate of need. Oh, by the way, one of the first things she did under her executive orders says, don't look behind the curtain, ignore the certificate of need for the time being until I say that it gets re-invoked again.
Right.
So hospitalization rate would help you determine, hey, do we really need to take drastic measures to flatten the curve or not? And what we've seen in Michigan is that we never maxed out on our capacity in any way, shape, or form. She never measured the hospitalization rate against the capacity in any tangible or meaningful way. And matter of fact, we had layoffs happening in all the hospital systems all across the state of Michigan. So infection rate, real infection rate, statistically sampled infection rate, mm-hmm. like they did out in Santa Cruz with Stanford. The hospitalization rate, and the last one is fatality rate.
That's right.
So how deadly is this? I mean, are we talking flu? Are we talking the Black Plague? What are we talking about here? Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing is that really fatality rates are on the order of what you'd see in the flu. So I think the first thing you need to do is go off and understand that science. And then, let's go flash back in time, back into March, and say, well, what were some other approaches that were being taken at this time? And I was one of the first to go off and call out, let's take a peek at what's going on in Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
They
That's right.
shut down it all. And they actually have mortality rate, or they're the same population as Michigan, yet the number of deaths that they had was half of what Michigan had. And then you look at what happened here in the United States with Governor Kristi Noem, who's a frickin' rock star. Mm-hmm. And as she runs for president in 2024, she's got a ready-made state chair for her out in Michigan, but if she needs it. But she said, you know what? I don't have the authority to go off and restrict your rights the way Gretchen Whitmer did. All I have the authority to do is say, we're going to make a case for social distancing or whatever. We're going to ask you to be responsible. If you're sick, stay at home. Don't spread it to everybody else, kind of like what you do with the flu. You're not supposed to go into work when you're coughing and sneezing and all that kind of stuff. She said, I'm going to trust my citizens to be an adult. And you know what happened? I mean, I think last time I checked for her numbers, I think they're around less than 50 deaths or something like that. And now, granted, South Dakota's not as high a population density as Michigan or anything, but still, when you actually look at it on a per capita basis, much lower than what happened in Michigan. And now we're seeing studies that say stay at home orders exactly the opposite of what you should be doing, because what is in New York, over 60% of the deaths that were coming in were from fellow family members going into the hospital. And so, because they're more confined, they're more exposed for a longer duration, and so it makes sense you don't do that. And you also don't do things like send COVID-19 positive victims to nursing homes, which is still a policy that's active today.
In Michigan. Well,
Yep.
because Cuomo, right? Murphy
Right.
in New Jersey. We had Newsom in California.
Yeah.
We had the governor in Minneapolis doing the same thing, and Whitmer. And Whitmer still has that policy in place, Pat.
So if you wonder why I get a little cheesed off at Republicans, they had a whole bunch of committee hearings and everything else, but so that they can go off and say, check the box, we went off and did. But there's nothing actually effective against this. When you look at it from an executive perspective, what can you do to go off and solve this? Start off by looking at the science and see what's working, what's not working. You know, there's no proof that lockdowns ever worked. There never was any proof that those ever worked. But if you have a political mindset, there's some advantages to a lockdown.
Oh yeah.
And I would surmise that she took more of a political science approach than a medical science approach to addressing COVID-19. And the fact that our Republicans sat back on the sidelines and did effectively nothing. You can make the case that they put in resolutions. You can make the case that they filed a lawsuit to go off and fight back to restore their powers, not our powers, mind you, but to restore their legislative powers. It's just very disappointing. And when you actually look at the plans that the Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker of the House put in Michigan, there wasn't a heck of a lot of difference between what they were proposing and what Governor Whitmer put forward. So I would submit that the way to go off and approach this is just by looking at the actual science. You're looking at things like face masks, and you look at are they effective against this disease, or are they not effective? Actually start having a discussion on it instead of freaking everybody out and sending a bunch of kids into the new school year wearing face masks and dripping Purell as they walk through the halls. I mean, this is getting a little bit ridiculous now. But if your goal is submission, if your goal is a fundamental transformation of America,
there you go.
This whole COVID-19 thing is a godsend, because under this unknown, unseen fear, they can tell you to do anything, and anybody who is not actually using critical thinking will do anything that they tell you to go off and do.
And that takes us to education, Pat, because right now, President Trump recently held a meeting at the East Room of the White House speaking about opening up schools. On the other hand, the Ivy, such as Harvard, says, no, we're not, this fall semester, no one's going to be on campus, and we're going to actually, all the Ivies have now canceled their athletic events. Obviously, everyone's concerned about getting the kids back to school, but there is a direct push from the teachers union of that not occurring around our country.
Well, from my perspective, education's been at the center of this fundamental transformation push for decades. Mm-hmm. And I was listening to an interesting YouTube video dating back to 1984, of all years, with a former KGB agent by the name of Yuri Byemenov. And he was talking about, a lot of people try to cast the KGB operations in this cloak and dagger James Bond style, where they're, secret agent versus secret agent. And he was highlighting, all that spy gadget stuff and all the espionage stuff that they show in the movies. That's only about 15% of our budget. The other 85% of the budget is going off and influencing them in much more subtle ways, mm-hmm. and really at the center of this fundamental transformation of America. William Z. Foster talks about it in his book, Towards a Soviet America. Cleon Skousen aligns 45 steps that they took, that they wanted to take here in his book, The Naked Communists. And he also, by the way, on the topic of the deep state, highlights another book called The Naked Capitalist that highlights what these guys are actually doing. A lot of the communists, the Ocasio-Cortez of the world, they're just useful tools or means to an end. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, everything that Yuri was talking about as a KGB agent for that 85% was broken down into what he called four different stages. Stage one was demoralization. And it's useful to underscore or underline the word moral.
Right.
Because what they were trying to do is undermine our morals in society, which means that they would go off and attack what a lot of Americans held as decency for years. They attacked the Judeo-Christian foundation of our founding. They'd attacked the fact that we believe that our rights are unalienable, endowed by our Creator with those rights. And they would do things like kick the Bible out of schools because you can't. But you can, meantime, you can go off and push Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye in the schools, which, for those of you who haven't read it, actually incentivizes the readers, according to Toni's own words, who was I think it was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author or whatever you call it, recognized. She wanted the reader to experience the act of rape while they read it. So she was very graphic, and that's what's being taught in our high schools now. And so that's part of that demoralization. It's taking the morals out of our schools. And if you look in the Michigan Constitution, under Article 8, Section 1 of the Michigan Constitution, it says that religion, morality, and knowledge being essential to good governance, education shall forever be encouraged. That's in our Constitution, which is something else that they're trying to wipe off the face of it. Right. They don't. So that 1787, or that provision, Article 8, Section 1, traces back to the 1787 Articles of Northwest Ordinance. And so a lot of these folks will try to make the case when they try to scrub morals from our foundation. They say, well, founding fathers weren't about religion or anything. They said that we had this wall of separation. Well, that wall of separation never exists. It was intended to go off and keep the government from doing exactly what they're doing right now to organizations like, most recently, Little Sisters of the Poor, with that ruling at the Supreme Court, which finally at least went in the right way for a change. But what we're seeing is a demoralization of the United States, and they're doing it through our education system and scrubbing morals. And by the way, I saw this a while back, and I'm going to make sure that it's available for download at letsfixstuff.org. But back in 2015, 2016 timeframe, they were proposing to put in new social studies standards here in the state of Michigan. And as somebody who used to be on a school board, and I looked at what the standards were at the time that they were pushing into our classroom, I was a little upset back then. I mean, they were pushing religion, but they were making sure we didn't talk about Christianity. They were pushing Islam. Mm-hmm. And I go, I have no problem with people learning about Islam, but why is that the focus of our initiative? So when I saw the new social studies standards that they were proposing, guess what it included? And I sat there and go, well, that's interesting. So I said, let's get engaged. And I went through and reviewed the whole social studies standards. And as an engineer, I like to go through line item by line item by line item. I submitted a whole bunch of revisions that I proposed to the State Board of Education to those standards. And to my surprise, they actually invited me to participate in a focus group to go off and define the next generation of standards. And I agreed. And for 2 years, I was on a focus group where I was pretty much outnumbered from a ideological point of view, 20 to 1. Mm-hmm. I was in there with a bunch of folks with letters after their name that were education professionals. And when I started off on my tenure there, I said, I got only 2 objectives: that whatever we come up with is politically neutral and it's accurate. And if we can all agree to those terms, I'm going to be happy, even if it's not exactly what I want. As long as it meets that criteria, you're going to have a cheerleader. And guess what? We actually did that. Mm-hmm. The first round through there, we got it, so it was politically neutral and accurate. And but then I was running for governor at the time when they came out. And so other people went through line item by line item, and if they saw one less reference to the KKK, they tried to paint me as a racist. And as me for the reason for deleting that. And people can look at what the suggestions that I had for. I mean, I've already talked about it already in this interview. I want people to know about the origins of the KKK and what their motives were and their methods were. And but that's not how it works. And in the media, they went off and did a hit piece on me. I even got called out in the New York Times for they're trying to put a conservative twist on it. No, there's no conservative twist. For decades, they've been pushing a progressive indoctrination in our schools, And finally, I had the audacity of saying, stop. We got to have a balanced perspective on it. I have no problem talking about your progressive dreams or whatever on it. But guess what? I want to start talking about a conservative perspective on this as well and give them equal treatment through the standards. And they couldn't have that. So it came out in the public square, a whole huge uproar, bunch of lies being spread in the media on this, being promoted out in these public forums all across the state. And I can't be everywhere at once to go off and refute them. And they decided to form another focus group after, and they specifically excluded me from participation in that focus group. And what they came up with was very telling, and it ties into what Yuri was talking about on the demoralization phase on it. There's really two main changes to what I had proposed and what they finally adopted. One was I had negotiated an agreement that said, listen, if you want to talk about the rise of Islam, you want to have a section on the rise of Islam, I think we could have a good discussion around that. But you know what? I wanted to have a section on the rise of Christianity as well, and what role that played in our founding, because there's a whole historical context to it in the First Great Awakening and our Declaration of Independence. There's a connected thread there. And that was the one item that they took out. They kept in the dedicated section on Islam and got rid of the dedicated section on Christianity. The other thing that they added in was I had said that if you want to talk about LGBT rights, which gets to the core of this moral portion of demoralization, I go, we can talk about that, but you also have to talk about rights of religious conscience at the same time. That's where the tension is in society today. You can't just push LGBT rights as a civil right without an acknowledgement of religious rights of conscience at the same time. Otherwise, you tee it up so that you're making the case that anybody who comes out against you is violating the rights of those people, when you're ignoring the fact that you're also violating the rights of, in many cases, of people of good conscience that hold different beliefs. Mm-hmm. So those were the two things. So I would make the case, and there's another topic of are we a democracy versus a republic. I made the case that really what they were doing, when you actually see what their motives were for the changes that were made, it's obvious that it was sedition. They were trying to undermine our system of government, redefine what our system of government was via these standards. They were pushing for us to be a democracy. We're actually a constitutional republic. When Ben Franklin came out of the first Constitutional Convention, he didn't say a democracy. He said a republic if you can keep it. And I really have an appreciation for what he meant with the if you can keep it part of that phrase nowadays. And why is that important? Because saying we're a democracy turned us into a mobocracy, and we're seeing that right now in BLM mode, and that's exactly what our founders called it. They called it a mobocracy. Now, Federalist Paper number 10 goes off and addresses this, and Ben Franklin, though, put it my favorite way. He said a democracy is like two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for lunch, and which is so true, and we're experiencing that today. So that my foray into education, and I served on education policy committee, so worked on, that was my, until I was kicked off all my committees. That's where my passion's been, is on the education front. But when you do that, you are going to get bloodied. Yep. And I was never a bomb thrower. I mean, you've watched me. I never target individuals on this stuff, but I hit policies with both barrels.
Right.
And I force people into uncomfortable positions because then they have to defend their point of view. Mm-hmm. Well, when I was in a fair fight, even though I was outnumbered 20-1, but I was given an opportunity to go off and defend my point of view, we won on every single one of these tenets. And that's what I want your listeners to take away. There is hope. If you actually study things like this Constitution, which is not a thick document, if you actually go off and study the Declaration, you study the history of our founding, you study those foundational principles, you will be much better armed than anybody with any number of letters after their name coming out of our university systems today. So, as a matter of fact, the university systems are so weak on that front that they're putting in these free speech codes to stifle it so that these professors don't have to answer these difficult questions in front of their students, which is another front that I was working on. And I had legislation that had the support of the Goldwater Institute and the ACLU, pretty diametrically opposed organizations, but they were unified on the need for free speech. That was held up by the deep state, who didn't want to go off and push this. The Senate Majority Leader had specifically blacklisted it for not moving anywhere, even though I had that support. So that stage one is demoralization. The next stage gets into destabilization. And I think we're seeing that with what's happening with President Trump. I mean, since the time he was elected, it was from Russian collusion, it was to Ukrainian scandal, it was to impeachment, it was COVID-19, now it's BLM. They were always going to pivot back to race because that's their comfort zone.
Yeah.
I predicted that back in 2019, and sure enough, that's what they're doing. And for viewers, I'm sure everybody watching your show knows this already. BLM is a Marxist group. It has nothing to do with race. It's Marxism. They are just one of the useful tools for this fundamental transformation of America crowd. And then after you get to this destabilization, you get into a crisis mode, which is, I think a lot of people, when you start seeing no toilet paper on the shelves, most people wake up to the fact that something's not quite right. And so the last part, according to Yuri, was that of quote-unquote normalization. And that's a euphemism for subjugation. Right. And that's what this all boils down to in this fundamental transformation of America. It is subjugation. It is fear-driven subjugation where they're funneling us into the cattle cars versus those who will take a stand for freedom, no matter how uncomfortable it may be at times. Which is why I kind of like the title of your show, Operation Freedom.
So, Pat, for our listeners, many are, I won't say despondent, but they're very upset, not only about what's happening, but about what they can do to make a difference.
Yeah.
You've made a difference. You've taken on all these entities. What can each one of our listeners do in their own family, in their own community, and for our country to make a difference, to subvert, if you will, these 4 stages that were outlined by this KGB operative that are being implemented to this day?
Well, I think it starts with first a recognition that the whole premise of fundamental transformation is that you're going from one state of existence or set of principles to another set of principles. So the first thing we all need to understand is we need to get that better understanding of what the from is. And for those of us who came late to the political battle, like myself, I mean, first 40 years I was oblivious to all this stuff. It means you got to study quick. And there's a lot of information out there, and you got to understand what those core principles are, and you got to be able to start defending. When they're starting to talk about tearing down statues of George Washington, no. He was the greatest president ever, and we were so blessed to have him as our founding father. He could have been a monarch if he wanted to be, and he chose not to. He chose freedom. He didn't choose to be a monarch. Look into the history of Abraham Lincoln. A lot of people are trying to cast him as a Democrat. Look into the actual history. No, he's a Republican, and you've got projects like the Lincoln Project trying to distort that. You need to understand your enemy. And I would submit that if you want to really zero in on a fast forward study of who the enemy is, look into the Howard Zinn Project. Now, the Howard Zinn Education Project is the basis of everything that I saw a clever little meme the other day, and it had a picture of Cindy Crawford on one side and a picture of her distinct mole on the other side. And essentially the caption was America, and had the picture of Cindy Crawford under it. And then on the right side, it said, what leftists see is just the mole. That's what the Howard Zinn Project is all about. They want to emphasize the moles of America without talking about everything that is beautiful, noble, excellent, and praiseworthy about America. So understand who that enemy is. The next part is going off and living your lives in a manner that exemplifies those principles. So when you see our law enforcement officers under attack, recognize that it's not people in uniform that they're under attack. What they're trying to do is undermine the rule of law.
That's right.
They're trying to undermine our constitutional republic. They're trying to get us to act like a mobocracy or a democracy. That's not who we are. So the way to go off and address that is what my good friend Apostle Ellis Smith did. They went out, and part of their church, they went out to the local precinct out in Detroit and brought them lunch. and served them and said, guys, we appreciate everything that you're doing. We got your back. And it's going to take those acts of kindness. It's going to take people like Karl Manke, who sits there and says, listen, talk to the hand, Governor Whitmer. You don't have the authority to shut us down. And ultimately, we've been let down by our representatives. We've been let down by our elected officials. It is up to the people to focus in on what's noble, true, excellent, and praiseworthy. They need to recognize that we are in an ideological war of subversion, where it's a war of ideas that could drastically escalate into a real physical war if we're not careful. But right now, it's a war of ideas still. We need to go off and make sure that we win that war of ideas. Mm-hmm. And so when you hear all the stuff that's going on with the mainstream media and all these false narratives, it's so obvious that it's a PSYOPs campaign. Mm-hmm. I used to work in the Department of Defense. I actually worked in helping to develop war game simulations, of all things. And, early on, I think the Operation Iraqi Freedom was probably one of the last wars where there was a defined blue versus red, if you will. There was a front line in that battle where you knew who the good guys were and you knew who the bad guys were. That was called symmetric warfare. We are engaged now in an era of asymmetric warfare where it's very difficult to understand who your enemy is. And in our case, you got to realize that a lot of these people that are marching with Black Lives Matter, mm-hmm. not our enemies. They're just duped into thinking that
they're clueless.
Right. And they don't understand the origins of this. They don't understand. They just sit there and say, I don't want anybody to be harmed. Well, guess what? Nobody wants anybody to be harmed except for these fundamental transformation advocates. Right. So our audience, our target audience is them, to let them know that is not who America is. We don't go off and put chokeholds on people even when they're screaming for help. That is not who America is. And so we got to go off and demonstrate support for law enforcement, demonstrate support for those who are doing what is noble, true, excellent, and praiseworthy. And in that manner, we're going to be on the road to go off and fight this false narrative that's out there. And we have to be fearless. Mm-hmm. Right now, too many of us are just living in fear. And I, as a Christian, I whenever I write a note in a book signing for my book, Wrestling Gators, I sign it with 2 Timothy 1:7 referenced in it, which means that God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but one of power, love, and self-control. We need to start tapping into that power. Mm-hmm. We need to start tapping into that spirit. And it's not an angry spirit. It can be a frustrated spirit at times, mm-hmm. but it is one where we have to convey that truth in love. You can't just sit there and go, all love, 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 and kind of join up with these Black Lives Matter folks. And next thing is, is that once you finally wake up from that stupor and actually realize what the truth is and where they're moving you, you're going, I didn't want to go there. So we have to get them, everybody, we have to convey the truth in love. If you're just all truth and you're whack, 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 and there's no love associated with it, nobody's going to listen to you. That's the challenge for all of us. We got to do truth in love. And if we do that, that's the main reason I never got kicked out of my caucus, right? Because if I would sit there and been bashing individual members of my caucus every single day, I would have been out of there in a heartbeat, because they were looking for an excuse to get rid of me. Mm-hmm. But their only excuse to get rid of me was Colbeck's actually following the platform. And that doesn't play well in Peoria, if you know what I mean.
Right.
So all of us, it's the same thing. You got to go off and first of all, understand what the truth is, which is why listening to programs like your Operation Freedom is so important, which is why I created the website letsfixstuff.org, so that we can get information you're not hearing in the mainstream media. That's why that's so important. Get the truth, and then go off with this army of we the people and go off and convey that truth and love.
Pat, let's conclude this interview. What do you foresee is going to happen in November?
I see turmoil no matter how the election for president turns out, unfortunately. I think, if President Trump wins, which is exactly what I hope will happen, because I think he right now is the only thing standing between us and that fundamental transformation of America that President Obama talked about 5 days before he was first elected. He's the only thing standing in between that happening and us. And that's why he's been so vilified, frankly, is because he is standing in the gap. Everybody else is quiet. Everybody else is silent. They're sipping on their champagne and eating their Grey Poupon. And meanwhile, the country is burning. And he's the only one that's willing to go off and take a stand. So he wins. We still got a battle because they're going to do Russian collusion phase 2. They're going to do Ukrainian scandal phase 2. They're going to do COVID scandal. They're going to keep on doing this. They're called progressives for a reason. They are incessant. They continually push and push and push. And keep in mind that the old Saul Alinsky adage is that the action is in the reaction. So they keep essentially poking the bear. They keep poking the bear and wait for us to respond and give them a reason to go off and really invoke the bear, if you will, the claws of the bear. Mm-hmm. So that's if Trump wins. We're still in a long fight because we've been silent too long at defending those core principles. If Trump, God forbid, loses, well, you know how I think it's Mark Levin talks about his bunker. No, who is it that? I think it's Mark Levin talks about the bunker. We're you, me, people that speak out. We're going to be targets. Mm-hmm. They're going to target our livelihood. They're going to target us for penalties for what they call free speech violations. Mm-hmm. We see it right now with what's going on in the social media with these so-called fact checkers. Which is also a reason why in that Let's Fix Stuff site, we have a section called the X-Files, which if you've been politically censored or you see politically censored content, we give you a home that ain't going to be blocked. We got some pretty good techies, as you know, mm-hmm. that are making sure that people will have a home to get that content out there. We're going to be targets. And you see it up in our neighbor to the north out in Canada. Some of the nicest people I ever want to go off and see, but tell you start speaking out against what simple red lines to the social studies standards that I propose, saying I want to have a balanced discussion of LGBT rights versus religious conscience rights. Just by saying that I had an issue with LGBT rights, I'd be thrown in jail. Mm-hmm. That's where we're headed here in America, and so it's going to be a disaster if Biden gets the nomination, because it's not even Biden. He's not even an ideologue. He's just
he's the sock puppet.
Exactly. The reason all these people lined up behind him so quickly is because they all saw that they could feed from his trough after he got elected. And so it's going to be bad news if that happens. I mean, our gun rights are at risk. Our religious liberty rights are going to be at risk. There's not a good ending if Biden gets in there. If Trump gets in there, at least we got another 4 years of a fighting chance. But it is still a delaying action. And until we start waking up as everyday citizens, we can't lean on President Trump all the time. He's got the weight of the frickin' world on his shoulders right now. He does. And he does not have enough help. He doesn't have a lot of people that are even helping him are just doing it for their own political purposes. They just figure that's the train that they want to ride. Right. They're not doing. A lot of people aren't doing it out of principle. We need more people doing it out of principle and understanding what's really at stake. Because after Trump's 4 years are done, we don't want America to be done. We got it. President Reagan left it like this, and maybe it's a good way to close things. You remember President Reagan's farewell address?
I do.
In his farewell address, what did he ask us to do? He goes, the one thing he was most disappointed on was the fact that he was encouraged by the fact that there was a rejuvenation of the American spirit, but he was disappointed that it hadn't yet been inculcated into the lives of everyday citizens. In other words, we hadn't really shown an internal appreciation for what it is to be an American. And he was worried that after he got out of office, people would stop acting like Americans and stop acting in appreciation for what America truly is from a freedom perspective. And that's where we are today. He was spot on. So I'm just encouraging everybody. They've got a pretty simple choice right now. They can go along with this fundamental transformation of America crowd and choose fear, or they can choose freedom. And when you choose freedom, just like the lives of those signers of the Declaration of Independence, that they pledge their lives, fortune, and sacred honor to, this is not a free price. Just like the people who serve us in the military have sacrificed everything to go off and defend those freedoms, we're going to be faced with that same battle. And people have to make their choice now. Do you choose fear or do you choose freedom? And I don't know about you, Well, I do know about you, Dave. I choose freedom, and I know you do too.
I do too. I do too. And Ronald Reagan actually is the reason why this show is named Operation Freedom. Because when I first went to Washington in 1988, when he asked me to work on healthcare policy with the Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, the introductory meeting that his administrative staff director had with several of us, he said the boss wants everybody on the same page of the playbook. And the first page of the playbook and the last page of the playbook and the only page of the playbook is this: your role in working on policy is not to look at the right-left axis. That's all meant to divide and conquer people. The axis you need to work on is upping freedom against those that want to work the down axis, oppression.
Yeah.
Your policies all have to focus on the up axis and trying to stop those that are inherently focused on oppressing the American public.
That's spot on, and I'll leave you with a final note. You know that I worked on the International Space Station for years, and many people don't know that the original name for the International Space Station was called Space Station Freedom. That was named by President Reagan. So if you want to talk about looking up, well, something orbiting in space is something easy to go out and look up to, and it was later changed by President Clinton. But I'll tell you, that was inspirational. I still have some of the early Space Station Freedom paraphernalia, and I'll tell you that's one of the we have to be focused on looking up, and we have to be focused on those noble pursuits, because America at its heart is truly a noble pursuit. That's why people are trying to get into our country. We don't have people pushing to get out of it.
We never had built the Berlin Wall as they did over there, did we, Pat?
No,
to keep
we did
people
not.
in.
Nope, and I've got a piece of the Berlin Wall over here, right behind me. If I had video, you'd see it. But it's one of those things that reminds me that we don't have to lock our citizens in.
No.
Not like Gretchen Whitmer and all the rest of these guys are doing. No. We're about freedom, and it's something very special, and we'll lose it if we forget about how precious it really is.
Educate, Pat, our listeners on your site and how they can get in touch with you.
Just go to letsfixstuff.org if you want to help support us and give me more time to go off and devote for more time towards developing solutions. Join what we call our Right Stuff Club there. But just go to letsfixstuff.org. That's letsfixstuff.org. And that'll plug you into everything you need to know on this stuff. We've got a balance of news feeds. We've got solutions. We've got good data sources to build good solutions off of. And we threw in a little bit of humor in there just to keep everybody sane throughout all this craziness. So have some fun up there. I hope you can go off and visit it. It's letsfixstuff.org. And Dave, thank you very much. You've been a dear friend, and you helped me get on this track towards public service. And it was your push for free market healthcare initiatives that inspired me to be bolder with these solutions. So thank you very much for all that you do.
Well, and thank you for everything you have done, are doing, and will do, Pat. You're an incredible patriot. You're an incredible freedom fighter, and I'm honored to call you a friend.
Right back at you, my friend. Knock 'em alive.
Same to you, Pat. I know you will. Folks, thanks for joining us today. Until next time, Dave Janda signing off. Dream big and dare to fail.